The life of John Wilson. John Wilson was used to living a modest life. Driving taxis in a big city was his daily routine, something he did with dedication and honor, even amidst a series of challenges. For him, being a taxi driver was more than just earning money. It was a job that required care and respect for people. He liked knowing that in some way he was helping others reach their destinations safely. When transporting elderly passengers, he made sure to carry the heavier luggage, helping them out of the car and ensuring they were fine before leaving. That was John, a simple and honest man who always did more than what was required of him. However, not all his co-workers shared the same vision. At the taxi stand where he worked, greed and dishonesty seemed to be the norm. More experienced taxi drivers took advantage of the passengers' good faith, especially the most vulnerable, such as the elderly or unsuspecting tourists. They overcharged for rides, took longer routes and used subtle tricks to ensure they always left with more money than they deserved. Ironically, these same co-workers seemed to live a comfortable life, flaunting new cars and designer clothes, while John, faithful to his principles, barely managed to support his family. At the end of each day, when John returned home, he was greeted by the tired smile of his wife, Sarah, and the hopeful eyes of his two sons, Tim and Michael. They were the reason he stood firm in his honesty. He wanted to set an example for his boys, teaching them that integrity was more valuable than any wealth gained dishonestly. But lately, even he had begun to doubt his convictions. His finances were in crisis. Bills piled up on the kitchen table, and the warning letters from the school about overdue tuition fees for the boys were becoming more frequent. His co-workers mocked him daily. "Wilson, when are you going to wake up? Honesty doesn't fill your stomach." They laughed every time he refused to take part in some scheme or overcharged distracted passengers. John heard the taunts but remained silent. He knew he couldn't compete with them in this dirty game. And, despite his dignity and tact, the reality was starting to weigh heavily on him. The financial crisis at home reached a critical point. In addition to credit card debt and the boys' school fees, John received the news that his car was about to be repossessed for failing to pay the renewal fees for his taxi license. For a taxi driver, losing the car meant losing his livelihood. Moreover, the eviction notice for their home was about to be issued, which only added to the pressure. Sarah tried to stay strong, but John could see the exhaustion and despair in her eyes. The family environment, once filled with unity and joy, was now weighed down with tension. John was on the verge of an emotional breakdown. He had always believed that by being honest, things would eventually work out. But with every door closing, he began to question this belief. Why do the dishonest seem to thrive, while I, who try to do everything right, am on the verge of losing everything? These questions hammered in his mind during the long hours he spent behind the wheel, and he began to feel suffocated by doubt. At the taxi stand, his co-workers continued to live in apparent prosperity. They arrived every day with new cars, talking about the vacations they were planning and the expensive things they bought. For them, deceiving passengers was part of the game, and they did it without the slightest remorse. John, however, refused to follow that path, even though it made him a constant target of disdain. For even so, amid the storm of his life, he held onto a flicker of hope. In his heart, something told him that somehow things would work out. But as the challenges grew, it became harder to maintain that faith. John's life seemed on the brink of collapse. He began to wonder if it was worth being honest in a world where dishonesty was rewarded. The weight of his doubts and the suffocating reality was becoming unbearable. And it was in this moment, amidst this turmoil, that something unexpected was about to happen. Something that would change the course of his life forever. It was a day like any other for John Wilson. The routine of picking up and dropping off passengers around the city had become almost mechanical for him. Parked at his taxi stand, he watched his colleagues as they chatted and laughed amongst themselves. They talked about their latest victories with unsuspecting passengers, while John remained silent, detached from their conversations. When a customer arrived, he took a deep breath, staying focused on his work ethic. Late in the grey afternoon, John was approached by an elderly man who walked slowly toward the taxi. His clothes were simple but clean, and he carried a small suitcase. As soon as the elderly man entered the car, something about the way he greeted John caught his attention. "Good afternoon, young man. Where are we headed today?" asked the passenger in a calm, almost serene voice. John smiled politely and started the car. The destination was a modest neighborhood in the city's suburbs. During the first few minutes of the trip, silence reigned. The elderly man seemed deep in his own thoughts, looking out the window as the city streets slowly passed by. After a while, the elderly man began to speak. "You know, young man, there's something I've learned over the years, the value of honesty. No matter how tough things get, it's always good to stay true to your principles." John listened, but didn't pay much attention at first. He was used to passengers who talked about all sorts of things. However, something about this man's voice felt different, like he knew more than he was letting on. "It's hard to be honest these days, isn't it?" the elderly man continued, without taking his eyes off the scenery. "Especially when it seems like the dishonest always come out on top." Those words hit John hard. He tried to hide his reaction, but the topic was something that had been brewing in his mind for weeks. The weight of his doubts, the financial struggles, and the feeling of constantly losing began to surface, and before he knew it, he was venting to the passenger. "That's exactly what I don't understand," John said, with a bitter tone in his voice. "I've been trying hard to be honest, to be fair to my passengers and my family. But while I struggle to pay the bills and keep my job, I see my colleagues cheating and thriving. They always have more money, always live an easy life, and I, who do everything right, it feels like I'm being punished for it." The elderly man listened attentively without interrupting. There was something comforting about his presence, something that made John feel safe to speak openly, as if he were talking to an old friend. When John finished his outburst, the passenger paused before responding, reflecting for a moment. "You know, young man, I understand how you feel, but life is a long journey full of twists and turns. What seems like an advantage now might not really be one. God has a purpose for all of us, even when we can't understand why certain things happen. Sometimes He places challenges in our path, not to break us down, but to shape us. Honesty and faith, those are the foundations that hold up our journey. It might not seem like it now, but they will be rewarded." John remained silent. The elderly man's words were comforting, but at the same time, he couldn't help but feel a touch of skepticism. How could someone keep their faith when everything around them seemed to be falling apart? He was on the brink of bankruptcy, his wife was desperate, and his children needed a better future. What was he doing wrong? What was keeping him trapped in this life of struggle? While those who chose the easy path prospered without difficulty, the car continued its journey through the city as the sky slowly darkened. John remained deep in thought, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The elderly man's words had affected him more than he cared to admit, but he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe his honesty was leading him to a dead end. "It's easy to lose faith when times are tough," the elderly man said, breaking the silence once more. "But remember, there's always a greater purpose. You just have to stay strong. What is true always prevails in the end." When they reached the destination, the elderly man smiled at John, as if he knew exactly the impact his words had made. "Thank you for the ride, young man. Remember what I said, and stay strong." John nodded, speechless. He watched the man slowly exit the taxi and walk toward the small house, the suitcase swinging lightly with his slow steps. For a moment, John sat there, thinking about the words he had just heard. He wanted to believe the old man was right. He wanted to believe that God truly had a purpose for everything, that his honesty and effort would one day be rewarded. But as he started the car to head back to the stand, doubt still lingered in his heart. Maybe the old man knew something that John couldn't yet see, or maybe his words were just a temporary comfort. Either way, those words would stay with him, echoing in his mind in the days to come. The next morning, John Wilson woke up early, as usual. The day began with no great expectations, like so many others, but he was still reflecting on the words of the elderly passenger from the previous day. "God has a purpose," he repeated in his thoughts as he prepared for another day's work. But as he put on his uniform, reality hit him once again. His debts, his children's school fees, and the impending repossession of his car weighed down on him like a storm about to break. When he arrived at his taxi, John did what he always did. He gave the vehicle a quick clean, keeping everything in order before starting the day. It was at that moment that something caught his eye. On the back seat, wedged between the cushions, was a large faded envelope. Curious, he picked it up, and upon opening it, his eyes widened in surprise. Inside was a check, and it wasn't just any check. The amount written was staggering, a sum so large that John had to look twice to make sure he was seeing it right. It was a check for $1 million. For a few seconds, John was frozen. His mind raced, and he began to sweat. How did this end up here? Who could have left this? Then he remembered the elderly passenger from the previous day. The man had exited the taxi calmly, with no sign of haste or worry. Could it be that he had accidentally left the check behind? John felt a whirlwind of emotions: panic, disbelief, and above all, a growing temptation. That amount of money was enough to solve all his problems. He could pay the school fees, recover the car, settle all his debts, and still secure a comfortable future for his family. All of this with a simple piece of paper that, for some inexplicable reason, was now in his hands. But along with the momentary euphoria came a corrosive doubt. He knew the check wasn't his, and if there was one thing John had always prided himself on, it was his integrity. The moral dilemma hit him full force. What should he do? Keep the check, which no one seemed to be missing, or return it, knowing it would mean continuing to struggle with his hardships? As John tried to process everything, the news of the check soon reached the ears of his colleagues at the taxi stand. When he mentioned what he had found, the other drivers reacted with a mix of envy and disdain. "What are you waiting for, Wilson?" said one of them with a sly smile. "You've got the golden ticket in your hands. You can finally get out of this mediocre life. No one will know if you keep it." Another colleague laughed, shaking his head. "Only Wilson would think of giving something like this back. You've got nothing, man. This check is what you need to turn things around. Don't be a fool." The words of his co-workers echoed in John's mind, further intensifying his confusion. In a way, they were right. No one would know if he decided to keep the money. The elderly man didn't seem to be searching for the check, and there was no clear way to trace the owner. But even so, something inside John resisted. He knew that keeping that money would be a betrayal of his principles, and perhaps the last shred of his faith would be destroyed if he made that choice. Still, the weight of the debts and the struggles pressed harder than ever before. When he got home that night, Sarah was waiting for him, worried. The family's financial crisis had reached its breaking point. "The bank called again," she said, her voice trembling. "They said if we don't make the house payment this month, they're going to evict us." John swallowed hard. He looked at his two children, playing in the living room, completely unaware of the gravity of the situation. All he wanted was to ensure the safety and future of his family. Sarah sensed that something was wrong, and when he told her about the check, her eyes filled with hope, and then with concern. "You have to think about the boys, John. We're at our breaking point. I know it's not right, but that money could solve everything," Sarah said, almost pleading. "I would never ask you this, but what if this is our only chance? You have to think about our family." She wasn't a bad person. Sarah had always supported John in his principles, but the pressure of reality was wearing her down. She was desperate, and he could see the fear in her eyes. It was a painful request, something she would never have made under normal circumstances. But the situation was spiraling out of control. John felt the weight of Sarah's words, combined with the pressure from his colleagues and his own consuming despair. He was on the verge of collapse. His mind was divided, and the temptation to keep the money grew stronger by the day. After all, he had a family to take care of. Their needs could no longer wait. In the days that followed, John couldn't sleep. The moral dilemma haunted him day and night, like a shadow that refused to leave him in peace. Every time he looked at the check, he felt the temptation grow. He could keep the money and solve all his problems, or he could return it and continue to struggle, not knowing when or if his luck would ever change. John stood on the brink of a decision that could define the rest of his life. What would you do? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The nights passed slowly for John Wilson. Lying next to his wife, he tossed and turned in bed, unable to find peace. The check was still tucked away in his pocket, like a constant weight pressing on his conscience. During the day, he pretended everything was normal, but the truth was that the dilemma was eating him up inside. His heart and mind were locked in an endless battle, and he didn't know how much longer he could endure. Every time he thought about keeping the money, an inner voice held him back. At the same time, the words of his colleagues and the desperation of his wife echoed in his mind, trying to convince him that keeping the check was the only solution to his problems. The piled-up debts, the imminent eviction notice, the repossessed car, and the children's school fees haunted him like ghosts at every moment. That night, something different happened. Physically and emotionally exhausted, John finally fell into a deep sleep. And it was in that sleep that he had a dream so vivid that it felt more real than any he had ever had. In the dream, John found himself alone in an open field, with no direction. The landscape was calm, but he felt a deep anguish in his chest, as if something big was about to happen. Suddenly, a calm and firm voice called his name. He couldn't see where it came from, but the presence was comforting, almost paternal. "John," the voice said, "do what is in your heart. Don't be guided by what you see before you, but by the faith within you." John looked around, trying to understand the meaning of those words. He wanted to ask more, but the voice continued. "The hardest decisions are the ones that shape our character. The answer you seek is already inside you. Don't act out of fear or desperation. Act out of truth." He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Then the field began to dissolve, and John awoke, his heart racing, a light layer of sweat covering his forehead. It was still the middle of the night, and the house was silent. Sarah lay beside him, breathing deeply and peacefully. He stayed there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what that dream could mean. For the first time in days, John felt an inner clarity. The voice in his dream had touched something deep in his heart, something he had known all along. He needed to return the check. The temptation to keep the money to solve all his problems at once was strong, but he couldn't betray his principles. This was a decision of faith, and it couldn't be guided by desperation or the lure of immediate relief. With his mind a bit more at ease, John got up the next day determined to do the right thing. But as if it were one last test, challenges still awaited him. When he told Sarah about his decision, she remained silent for a moment, processing his words. He could see the conflict in her eyes. She had always supported him, but the financial desperation was wearing her down. "John, I understand what you're saying, but what about the kids? What about our home?" she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I know you want to do the right thing, but we're drowning. What if this is a chance God gave us to get out of this? Maybe it's a different kind of test." John felt the weight of her words, but he had already made up his mind. He hugged Sarah and looked into her eyes. "I know it seems like the easier path, but I can't do it. I can't let money, no matter how much it could fix things, destroy who we are. Honesty is all we have left. I can't teach our kids that it's right to take advantage of something that isn't ours, even if it's for our own good. We'll find another way." Sarah, overwhelmed, began to cry, her emotions overflowing. She knew John was right, but the fear for their family's future made her want to believe he was wrong. "I just want this to end," she said between sobs. John held her tighter, feeling the weight of his decision in every fiber of his being, but knowing that he couldn't choose any other path. At the taxi stand, things weren't any different. When John told his co-workers about his decision to return the check, they erupted in mocking laughter. "You're such a fool, Wilson," one of them exclaimed. "That money is your way out, and you're just going to give it back. This only proves how weak you are." Another colleague shook his head in disdain. "You're going to stay stuck in the mud while the whole world prospers. People like you don't get anywhere because you refuse to play the game." The words were harsh, but John was resolute. He knew the path of integrity was difficult and that external pressures would try to make him stray, but his conscience had already chosen the path he should follow. Even knowing he would continue to face hardship, he prepared to return the check and move forward with the certainty that he was doing the right thing. But what he didn't know was that his decision was about to change everything in a way he could never have imagined. John Wilson, determined to follow his conscience, took the check the next morning, and headed to the address where he had dropped off the elderly passenger. It was a simple house in a quiet neighborhood, far different from what he had imagined for someone carrying a check for $1 million. His mind was still full of doubts, but his decision was clear. He would return the check and move on with his life, no matter the consequences. When he arrived, he parked the taxi and walked to the door, feeling the weight of everything at stake. His family, his debts, his home. Everything could have been resolved if he had chosen to keep the money. But now, he was about to give away the only thing that seemed capable of changing his fortune. Before knocking on the door, he took a deep breath, as if saying goodbye to that opportunity forever. The door was opened by the same elderly man he had driven days before. The man looked at John, and a serene smile spread across his face. "Good morning, young man," he said, as if he already knew the reason for John's visit. John was momentarily speechless, but soon extended his hand with the check. "I found this in the back seat of my taxi after you left," John said, his voice slightly trembling. "I can't keep this. It belongs to you." The elderly man looked at the check in John's hands and, with a calm expression, nodded for him to come in. "Please come in," the man said, stepping back to let John pass. John entered the house, which was as modest as it looked from the outside. There was nothing extraordinary about the place, just a cozy living room and a simple kitchen. John sat in an armchair across from the man, who now held the check in his hands. "You have no idea how long I've waited for this moment," the elderly man said, looking at the check with a glint in his eyes. John, confused, furrowed his brow. He couldn't understand what the man was trying to say. "Let me explain," the man continued, placing the check on the coffee table between them. "For years, I've been trying to find someone worthy of inheriting my fortune. I have no children, and after a lifetime of hard work, I've accumulated much more than I could ever spend. But I wanted this money to go to someone honest, someone who wouldn't be consumed by greed, someone who understood the value of integrity." John sat in silence, trying to process what he was hearing. "This check you found," the man said, "was part of a test. Over the years, I've intentionally left this check in various situations. I always hoped that the person who found it would return it, but until now everyone has tried to cash it for themselves." He chuckled lightly. "What they didn't know is that the check had no funds. To the dishonest, it was worthless." John felt a chill down his spine upon hearing that. "So, this was all a test?" The man nodded. "Yes, it was. And you, John, are the only one who passed. When you decided to return the check, you proved that you're a person of character. And that's why now I want you to inherit my entire fortune." John was speechless. The offer was so unexpected that he couldn't believe what he was hearing. I don't know what to say," he stammered. Is this real?" The elderly man nodded again, a warm smile on his face. "Of course it's real. I've been looking for someone like you, someone who values honesty more than money. And now I know you're the right person to receive what I have to offer." John felt his heart racing. For a moment, all the pressure, the debts, and the weight he had been carrying seemed to disappear. He had never imagined that his decision to do the right thing, even in such difficult times, would lead him to something so grand. "But why me?" John asked, still in disbelief. The elderly man smiled again. "Because you proved that even when everything was against you, you still chose the path of honesty. That's the kind of person I want to see prosper, someone who understands the value of doing the right thing, even when no one else seems to care." John sat there, trying to absorb everything that was happening. He thought about Sarah, his children, and all the hardships they had faced together. The idea that his integrity had in fact changed his destiny was almost unbelievable, but at the same time, he felt an immense sense of relief. Everything he had sacrificed, all the suffering and struggles, was now being rewarded. I accept," John finally said, "and I promise I'll do my best to honor the trust you're placing in me." The elderly man smiled once more, satisfied with the response. "I'm sure you will. And besides, your story deserves to be told. I'm going to make sure the world knows what you did, John. Your honesty in a time of so much dishonesty is something that should be recognized." From that moment on, John's life changed forever. Not only did he inherit the elderly man's fortune, But his story soon became public. Newspapers and news outlets across the country began sharing the journey of the humble taxi driver who, even in the midst of the greatest crisis of his life, chose to do what was right. He was celebrated as an example of integrity in times of adversity, and his story touched the hearts of millions. With the fortune he inherited, John Wilson's life changed in ways he could never have imagined. From an honest taxi driver drowning in debt, he now had the resources to transform not only his own reality, but also that of countless others. Yet, the decision he made that day, returning the check, remained the cornerstone upon which he built his new life. He could have used the fortune solely for himself and his family, paying off his debts and securing a comfortable life. But John knew that his honesty had been the key to this remarkable turnaround, and inspired by the elderly man who had trusted him, he decided to use most of his newfound wealth to help others facing similar struggles. The first thing he did was establish charities dedicated to caring for the most vulnerable, the elderly, children and families in financial crisis. John knew how hard it was to maintain dignity in times of need, so he created programs that offered educational assistance, financial support and housing to those who needed it most. The institutions he founded soon expanded across the country, and John became known not just for the fortune he had inherited, but for how he chose to use it. His life story, as a man who remained steadfast in honesty despite temptation and hardship, became a source of inspiration for many. People from all over the country reached out to him, writing letters or visiting, sharing how his decision had touched their lives. Many admitted that they were on the verge of abandoning their own principles due to financial struggles, but upon hearing John's story, they found the strength to continue doing what was right. John remained humble despite his newfound position. He knew that money was a means, not an end, and that the true legacy he wanted to leave behind was the example that honesty and faith are rewarded, even when it seems impossible to see that reward in the moment. He and Sarah rebuilt their lives, now with financial security they had never known before, but always remembering the tough times and the lessons those days had taught them. John's story became a symbol of hope in a world increasingly dominated by material pressures and ethical dilemmas. Many of those who had criticized or mocked his honesty before, like his colleagues at the taxi stand, now saw in him an example of how integrity and character were the true riches. John never despised them, understanding that everyone had their own internal battles. However, he hoped that his experience might help them rethink their own choices. John also made sure to give his family a fresh start. The debts were paid, the house was saved, and his sons, Tim and Michael, could finally attend school without the looming shadow of financial uncertainty. Sarah, who in a moment of desperation had asked him to keep the check, now fully understood why he had made his decision. Though she had acted out of fear at the time, she had never stopped being a person of principle. John's actions strengthened her faith, and she became a great partner in the charitable work he founded. The impact of John's story continued to grow, and he received numerous invitations to share his life journey at conferences, churches, and charity events. Though he was never one to seek the spotlight, he accepted these invitations to spread a message of faith and honesty. One evening, after a long day organizing a new housing project for homeless families, John sat on his porch gazing at the stars. He thought about how far his life had come since the day he found that check in the back seat of his taxi. The weight of the decision he made back then seemed even greater now, as he saw the ripple effect his honesty had on the world. Yet, at the same time, he knew there was something larger behind it all. John firmly believed that none of it was by chance. He understood that the test the elderly man had given him wasn't just about money. It was about what it meant to keep faith in the darkness. The true gift he had received wasn't the fortune, but the confirmation that, regardless of the circumstances, doing what's right would always prevail. As John continued his philanthropic work, he reflected on the importance of his journey. He had chosen the harder path, but now he saw that this path had led him to a place of true peace and purpose, and that was the message he wanted to leave with the world. In times of crisis, being honest may seem like a difficult choice, but it's in the darkest moments that integrity shines the brightest. When we stay true to our principles, God leads us to rewards far beyond what the eye can see. Don't let hardships corrupt you. Keep the faith, because honesty is always the most prosperous path.